Hello, welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today we're going to be talking about our very first eukaryotes found in the domain Eukarya. Now, we've already talked about bacteria and we've talked about archaea and bacteria as domains holding these prokaryotes, things that don't have a nucleus, these bacteria that lack that membrane-bound nucleus. Protists and fungi are part of the domain Eukarya, just like animals and plants. To start, let's talk about protists. Protists are weird, just flat out, as a kingdom. And I've spent all this time telling you how Carolus Linnaeus spent all this time coming up with classification system based on observable features, but now we use a classification system based on evolution, and how hard we work to make sure that all of our kingdoms are classified appropriately based on evolutionary relationships, organisms that are more closely related to one another. Protists kind of throw that out the window. Actually, there is a lot of conversation, a lot of talk that really the kingdom Protista needs to be split apart into several different kingdoms. Some people have suggested 6 new kingdoms of protists. Some have suggested 3. But the fact is, we can say that protists are split into really 3 general clades. A clade is a group of organisms from a common ancestor. So we can actually look at some common ancestors in the Protist kingdom and sort of see where they branched apart based on that. Let's discuss some of the things that protists have in common, mostly. All protists are eukaryotes. All of them have a nucleus. Some protists are autotrophs, like seaweed and euglenas. Some are heterotrophs, like the paramecium, the amoeba, the slime mold, and again, the euglena. It's a very, very odd protist. Some are multicellular, like seaweed. Some are unicellular. Actually, most of them are unicellular, everything except for the seaweed. But they all need a moist environment to survive. So, to recap, the things that protists have in common is they all have a nucleus and they like to live in moist environments. That's actually about it. That's what they have in common. This is the kingdom that sort of breaks the rules. In addition, that's why it's known as the junk drawer kingdom. Basically, if it doesn't belong anywhere else, this is where we're going to classify it. Let's talk about those 3 clades. So the first clade that we want to talk about is the animal-like. They all have some type of movement at some point in their lives. And so that movement is how we're going to classify them. Sarcodines move using pseudopods. These are things like amoeba. Ciliates move using cilia. Makes sense, right? The paramecium. Flagellates move using a flagella, like dinoflagellates. Flagella are just whip-like tails. And then, of course, sporozoa are a little bit different. They're a little special because remember, this is the kingdom that breaks those rules. These are parasitic protists that usually are going to move through a host. The second clade I'm going to talk about are the plant-like protists. These are the ones that are capable of doing photosynthesis, things like algae and the euglena. I keep coming up with that word euglena. Euglena is a very interesting protist because it's capable of doing photosynthesis or it's capable of consuming food depending on the conditions it finds itself in. Algae can be as simple as single-celled organisms living together in a colony. Think the algae that grows in a fish tank or in a swimming pool. Or they can be giant seaweeds, like the 15-foot-long kelp that live in the kelp forest. Our third clade are the fungus-like protists. These are the ones that behave like fungus. Water molds and downy molds, and not listed here, here are some examples of some of these organisms. So the first 2 belong to the animal-like protist, the paramecium. And I've given you these pictures so that you can see what we're talking about. The little fuzzy-looking hairs on the outside of that paramecium in that very first picture, Those are the cilia, and they're actually going to use them like tiny oars to move around through the water. And again, these are single-celled organisms. They're microscopic. You have to have a microscope to see them. An amoeba is going to move using its pseudopod, its false foot. And this is basically where it pushes its cell membrane out and allows the cytoplasm to stream in and allows it to move. These guys are able to actually surround their food with their false feet, their pseudopods, and actually pull food into their bodies. They kind of eat like Bob the Blob from Monsters vs. Aliens. And of course, the last one that we're going to talk about is the euglena. It's both heterotrophic and autotrophic. It is classified as a plant-like protist, despite the fact that it is capable of eating. And it uses a flagella, that whip-like tail, in order to move. And again, remember that these protists, it's a really weird kingdom, and they're not cohesive like the other kingdoms we're going to talk about. Just some other examples here. We have the plant-like protist, seaweed, and diatoms. So seaweed can be multicellular, of course. They're all autotrophic in this particular clade. And diatoms can actually, despite being unicellular, they're microscopic. They produce these beautiful silica shells, and that's what you're seeing in that picture there. Their shells look almost glass-like, and when they die, they leave their shells behind. Their shells make up something we call diatomaceous earth, and we use it in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways that we use it is actually as a polishing agent. Most common placement is in toothpaste. Fungus-like protists are going to be things like those water molds we talked about and slime molds. Slime molds are really interesting. They're unicellular. They're going to live colonially. They like to hang out in groups. They use spores in order to reproduce, just like fungus will, which you'll learn about here in a minute. And they are heterotrophic. They have to consume food to create energy. Slime molds are really unique because they live sort of unicellular lives until it's time for them to reproduce, and they come together and they produce this fruiting body. You all have probably seen slime molds. You just didn't realize that's what they were. This picture shows sort of this bright yellow slime mold living on a tree. They like to hang out on things that are decaying or things that are wooden. And so you might see them there. You might see them on the ground as you're walking. But they typically are going to be in bright colors. So that bright yellow, bright orange, even purple, Pepto-Bismol pink is another color that I see a lot. So these slime molds are able to move. They use amoeboid movement, and they actually will move their way to a new location as they run out of food. But right now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to start talking about a slightly more complex kingdom, or at least a kingdom filled with slightly more complex organisms. We're going to talk about fungus. Number one, fungus are heterotrophs. They cannot make their own food. A lot of people seem to think they can, and they cannot. They are not plants. All fungi are eukaryotic. They all have a nucleus. They're all heterotrophic. Almost all fungi are multicellular, different from protist. Yeast, however, is a fungus and it is unicellular. They're sessile. Fungi don't move from place to place. They pretty much stick in one spot and stay there. They're going to reproduce using spores. They may reproduce sexually before producing spores. Yeast is different. It's not going to use spores to reproduce. Yeast actually reproduces by budding, which just means it's going to grow its offspring off of its body. These guys need a warm, dark, moist place in order to live. And most interestingly, they have cell walls that are made of chitin. This is different than the cell walls in plants that are made of cellulose. I've popped back onto my protist area because I want to point something out really fast. Remember when I just talked about fungus and I talked about how they use spores and they're heterotrophic? Those are the same characteristics that we see in fungus-like protist. This is part of the reason why protist kingdom really needs to be rearranged. It needs to be reorganized, maybe into more kingdoms, because these organisms are more closely related to fungus than they are to the plant like protist or the animal like protist. And because of that, it really doesn't fit well within the group. Let's talk about some of the parts that make up fungus. Hyphae is really the main body of all fungus. It can be thread like and it can stretch very, very far. Hyphae is what it's going to use to actually absorb the nutrients and the sugar it needs in order to survive. It does it by growing through its food source, secreting enzymes to help digest the food that it's growing through, and then literally absorbing those nutrients as things get broken down. But when it's time for it to reproduce, it's actually going to use that hyphae. It's going to have it grow together and twist together. It's going to turn it into whatever fruiting body it needs. So if you look at this example I've given you the mushroom example there, and you can see the bread mold example. Those are two different types of fruiting bodies, but both are producing spores. So now I'm going to gross out a little bit. If you look at that bread mold, you see how the hyphae is growing through that slice of bread. We actually can't see mold on bread until the fruiting bodies start to form. And that slice of bread and those bread mold fruiting bodies are not to scale. It is not that large. Basically, what you see are the fuzzy black or fuzzy green on the bread. Those are the fruiting bodies. Prior to that, you don't really see the mold because it's all under the surface. It's the same thing with mushrooms. All the hyphae is under the surface until it's time for it to reproduce. That's the first time that we see it. So if you've ever gotten bread out of the bag and it's moldy, and you ate the bread the day before or the day before that, or even sometimes the day before that, you were eating that mold. It was already there. So just something to keep in mind. Mold is everywhere. Fungus is definitely going to be among us. There are 4 basic types of fungi. You are not required to know these types, but I did want you to recognize that there are different types. You're going to have some that are going to have that thread-like appearance. These are going to be things like our bread molds. You're going to have some that are going to have your traditional classic mushroom shape. Um, our water molds are definitely different than either the bread molds or the mushroom type of fungus. So just keep in mind that there's this whole plethora of different fungus and fungal shapes that could exist, but we are able to sort of classify them into these 4. That's all we have time for right now.